Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. In today's episode, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And today I want to provide a video. This video is produced by an Austrian military officer who is going to provide his overview of the recent failed Ukrainian counteroffensive. Now, this is obviously late coming, and it is very, very sensitive for the NATO command structure to have this sort of video put out. And unfortunately, here in the United States, we will have 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 people tune in to the likes of Denis Davidov, the individual who fled Ukraine and now makes up these erroneous reports of the ongoing war efforts, and obviously from the Ukrainian side, in which he fled the Ukrainian side out of fear of being inducted into military service. But I'm not going to get in on that. I want to show this video and provide commentary as we go. Here we go.
Welcome to the Austrian Terrorism Military Academy. I'm Colonel Markus Reisner. I'm the head of the Department of Research and Development, and I'm currently the commander of the Honor Guard in Vienna. Today we will have a look at the so-called Ukrainian summer offensive and how the status actually is at the moment. We waited for a couple of months to come up with this video because we wanted to have some kind of final results, and after 195 days we actually can have already a first assessment about the offensive. Before we start with a deep dive into the Ukraine...
Just pause real quick. Again, the delay in the production of this content, again, very sensitive, and this could not have been released during, at the end, or after, and obviously the offensive failed many weeks ago. Here we go.
In counteroffensive, we would like to show you two slides from our last brief at the beginning of June. The idea was to show in these slides what were the expectations referring to the Ukrainian counteroffensive. At that time, we assessed that there will be some kind of a final and decisive attack direction south in order to split the Russian occupied territory in two sections, the one in the southwest and the other one in the northeast, in combination with a further attack against the bridge over the Strait of Kerch. The strategic effect, the intended, was to force, by isolating the Russians in the southwest, the Russians to the negotiation table. We also assessed that there are different options the Ukrainians can use when they will actually start their offensive. First, also deception, so trying to force the Russians to bring reserves to the northeast of the country. Maybe also to use an amphibious landing in the south, which was later not possible because of the destruction of the Novochakova Dam. And of course, an attack against the bridge over the Strait of Kerch. Some things worked, others not. But finally, on the 4th of June, the Ukrainians started their attack along three main attack axes. One north of Tokmak and Melitopol, the other one north of Berdyansk and Mariupol, and the third one in the area of Bakhmut. The expectations were high from the offensive. The idea was that especially the equipment which was delivered from the west, so modern main battle tanks like the Leopard or the Challenger, or infantry fighting vehicles like the CV-90 or the Bradley or the Marder will make the difference. But the first hours showed that the Russian defense line were well prepared, and these were the pictures we actually saw in the beginning of the Ukrainian operation. And it was General Zaluzhny, the commander of the Ukrainian forces, who stopped pretty much the operations because of the fact that the losses were so high. We would like to show you now a short video from the 47th Mechanized Brigade, the brigade which were spearheading the attack to the north of Tokmak and Melitopol, to give you an idea how the situation looked like when the Ukrainians tried to breach into the Russian defense lines. Having looked at the video, we now would like to give an idea how such a complex operation can look like. And therefore we use a manual from the US Army, and this manual describes in detail what kind of capabilities you need when you would like to conduct a successful breaching operation in order to break through to an enemy defense line. So there are certain terms which are important. The first term is the term suppress. So it's important that you have protection forces which are reducing the enemy forces on the other side. But this hasn't worked quite well. The next term which is important is the term of obscure. So you have to hide your forces to the enemy by using, for example, smoke or smoke grenades. Also here, smoke was used, but only 3% of all the fire missions of the Ukrainian side were actually firing smoke. The next term is the term secure. You have to isolate the area where you would like to conduct a breach, and you have to make sure that the enemy will not be able to use his mobile reserves against you. Also this just in a few cases worked because the Russians were using certain assets from the distance, like helicopters, but especially mobile anti-tank teams which were working on the Ukrainian troops. And the last term which is important is the term reduce, because you have to physically reduce.
Physically reduce. This is incredibly important. And this is one of the big issues that I've talked about previously, which the Ukrainians didn't have. The ability to reduce the strength of Russian forces in those phase lines, in those areas of operations. And you need to do that with air power. In the modern battlefield, it has to be done with air power. The next best option for the Ukrainians would have been ATACMS, but the Ukrainians didn't have ATACMS or some of those systems that would create an environment for this offensive to succeed.
All the obstacles from the other side, like the minefields, you have to conquer and overcome the tank trenches, and of course the Dragon T's and all the other obstacles in order to breach into the Russian defense lines. And the fact is that if you don't have all these four capabilities and terms fulfilled, you will be not able to attack, and this is what actually happened at the beginning of the Ukrainian offensive at three certain parts of along the front line. Let us look once again a little bit in detail on all the different capabilities both sides had. Let's start first with the Russian side. So the Russians had a variety of different assets they were using. Actually minefields, Dragon T's, concertina wire, mobile anti-tank troops, local fire support like mortars, but also mobile reserves like heavy mechanized units which were on standby and were used against the Ukrainian side. But most important, they had significant combat support, especially artillery and rocket artillery, and of course the air domain, because they were using their helicopters from a safe distance and ground attack aircraft, and they had sufficient drones which they were used.
Just a quick pause. Yes, the attack helicopters were incredibly important. Not just the fact that they were using helicopters, the air-to-ground missiles that the Russians were using on these aircraft, on these Ka-52s, Mi-28s, Mi-24s, even transport helicopters within the Russian domain are now being used to fire these extremely long-range guided missiles outside of the Ukrainian air defense envelope in terms of short-range capability. That was one of the key factors. And then obviously the Lancet drone as well had huge success in preventing the success of the Ukrainian offensive. Here we go.
For reconnaissance, and of course also as kamikaze drones against the Ukrainian troops. On the other side, the Ukrainians were also prepared to conduct this breaching operation. They had, of course, elements which they used to reduce the enemy obstacles. They had the breaching force consisting of main battle tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, and they also had combat support like artillery and also rocket artillery, but they were completely missing the air component. So there were no attack helicopters, no attack aircraft, and of course there were also no special weapon systems like ground-to-ground rockets like ATACMS, which were not delivered at that time. And of course, the number of drones they were able to use were significantly lower than the Russian side.
Needed to pause and comment on this too. One of the reasons the Ukrainians had difficulty deploying, say, the Switchblade 600 and 300 and other FPV drones in the area such as near north of Tokmak was because of the Russian electronic warfare capability. That's not really talked about in this, but that is one of the reasons why that was negated and the Russians had the ability to operate its drones over the Ukrainian offensive. Then obviously the Ukrainians didn't have the air capability. I've talked about that before again.
The result was that there were tactical successes, like the Ukrainians managed to occupy certain strong points along the defense lines, like Rapotinia and Verboe, but they weren't able to breach into the defense lines or go or break through direction to south. And if you compare the results on a bigger scale, then we can see that to the north of Tokmak and Melitopol, there was only a breach of about 8 to 10 kilometers. East of it, to the north of Berdyansk and Mariupol, the breach was about 12 kilometers. And also in Bakhmut, the results were very moderate. And compared to the distance from the breaching area to the Azov Sea, you can actually see that the results were very minor compared to the intended operational result and the strategic effect, which was the plan from the Ukrainian side. When we look at the defense line from the Russian side, then we can see that it was a very complex system of different defense lines. So there was a combat outpost line, which was, of course, breached by the Ukrainians. There was a defense line which even was assisted by a second defense line in depth, and there were further defense lines to the south of Rapotinia and even the defense line around the main capitals. So what the Ukrainians managed is to break through the combat outpost line and to break into the first defense line, but the attack finally was stopped in that area. So the question is, what happened to the Ukrainian game changers? We have already discussed the role of the mechanized force, but we should not forget that significant different weapon systems were not available, either because they were not delivered or the quantity was low. So the ground-launched small diameter bomb was not available. It's still not available. It might be delivered next year. On the other side, of course, the Su-24M was adapted for the use of Storm Shadow and Scalp, but it's not a problem of the quantity of those air-to-ground weapon systems. It's the question of the quantity of the available platforms like the Su-24M to be used against the Russian side. And the third very important aspect was that the so-called brigades of the offensive, the 9 brigades which were more or less prepared by the West, plus the 3 brigades which were prepared by the Ukrainians, obviously had not the correct training status to fulfill this very complex task. I was already referring to an article in the Washington Post. The article in the Washington Post lined out in detail the problems, especially in the shaping phase of the operation. So there was a different approach on how to conduct the operation, especially from the US side and from the Ukrainian side. While the US side emphasized that there should be one main effort, so one attack direction to the city of Tokmak and Melitopol, the Ukrainians insisted to follow actually 3 attack axes. So one in direction of Melitopol, the other one in direction of Berdyansk and Mariupol, and the third attack axis along Bakhmut. So the Russian side had the advantage that they were able to more or less fight against Ukrainian troops on 3 different parts of the front line, which, and this is the US argument, made it difficult for the Ukrainians to break through because they were not actually having all the troops at one certain point available and in order to have the force actually to break through in direction south. After the initial stage of the Ukrainian offensive failed, General Soluzhny ordered to switch tactics. So at the beginning of the offensive, the Ukrainians tried to attack from, and if you compare that with a chessboard, from one field to the other one. But they were trapped in a mix of...
I wanted to pause again just quickly. So what we're hearing in regards to this change of tactics, and you notice how he stated that it was General Zaluzhny's idea or instructions to change tactics. It was the battlefield commanders on the ground, company commanders, battalion commanders, Ukrainian commanders, that felt that they needed to use the tree lines and use smaller units using tree lines to overcome Russian defensive operations. Now, obviously, that didn't work, but again, that was something that was discovered on the ground while fighting against the Russians. That idea obviously was filtered up, was moved up, and then ultimately Zaluzhny then states this order that they use these tree lines. Here we go.
Russian anti-tank weapons, Russian helicopters, minefields, and other assets. So what they did is actually to switch the tactic in a different way, and therefore we have to understand a little bit the terrain in Ukraine, which is very, very flat, and the different terrain features are split in between by tree lines. So the idea of the Ukrainians was not to attack from one field to the other one, but to follow these tree lines in between the fields and attack from one field to the other. And that brought success, but in a very, very slow motion and with high losses. After we have looked at the tactical and operational challenges, we also have to have a look at the strategic outcome of the offensive. And this map shows very clearly how the success was from the Ukrainian side. You can actually see that along the three main attack axes, so north of Tokmak and Melitopol, north of Berdyansk and Mariupol, and in the area of Bakhmut, the success was very limited. So 8 to 10 kilometers in the central area, or 10 to 12 kilometers, and very limited results in the area of Bakhmut. On the other side, the Russians also had success because they also were occupying certain parts along the front line. But the problem is that the brigades of the offensive, the 9 brigades which were equipped by the West and the 3 brigades which were equipped by the Ukraine, those brigades of the offensive are now worn out, so they are not available anymore, and they are split along the whole front line, like the 47th Mech Brigade, which was spearheading the attack on the 4th of June and is now actually was transferred from the central area to Avdiivka because the pressure there is very high against the Ukrainian troops. Again, we have to look into the past to get an idea how a successful operation can look like actually. And there is one example which is a very good example because it shows how important the different branches of armed forces are. And this is the example of the Operation Cobra in summer 1944 in Normandy. That was the breakout of the Allied forces from the bridgeheaders along the landing beaches and the push into the depths of the French countryside. And the beginning of Cobra was the initial phase, a massive bombardment of the German positions along more or less the forward line of front troops, and the massive Allied bombardment resulted in high losses of the German forces, in this case the Panzerlehr division, which was more or less deployed along the forward line of front troops, and the Americans were able to break through with 3 armored divisions to the south and to the southwest. So we can actually see that the difference was made especially by this bombardment at the beginning of the offensive. And those air assets the Ukrainians had not available at the beginning of their offensive. At the beginning,
air power, an air force, incredibly crucial. Obviously, during World War II, and even now, I don't even say even now. It's even much more needed now in the modern era in terms of what happened in that debacle of a counteroffensive, one force without an air force attacking a much larger opponent that has an air force and a sizable air force while you have none is just nonsensical.
Of June at this year. While from week to week it was becoming more and more clear that there is no real Ukrainian success or breakthrough, on the other side of the hill, on the Russian side, morale rose. And also here we can see that the Russian is using in its propaganda elements from the so-called Great Patriotic War in the Second World War, where the Soviet soldier fought successfully the German Tiger tank, like today, where the Russian soldier fought successfully the German Leopard tank or the American Bradley. And that brings me to the point, because the narrative until now was that the Russian soldier is not able to fight equally to the Ukrainian side.
Yeah, this is what also I was very concerned with. We were seeing lots of this. Well, one Ukrainian is equal to 10 Russians, and just really miscalculation. Just not taking your opponent seriously, degrading the opposing force, and they got their asses kicked by that force, hands down.
And this is a narrative we have to rethink, because the biggest mistake you can do is actually to underestimate the enemy. And I give you another example here from military intelligence from Great Britain, because the Brits are admitting here actually that especially the Russian air defense is quite successful, not only against the Ukrainian Air Force, but also against certain air-to-ground or ground-to-ground systems, like the HIMARS and the GMLRS rocket, or of course the Scalp and Storm Shadow missiles, which at a certain scale are shot down by the Russian side. And the Russians are adapting in a very simple and successful manner by, for example, using old bombs of a weight of 500 to 1,000 or even 1,500 kilograms, which they adapt, and from a so-called dump bomb they are able to make out an intelligence bomb, which is they actually can use from a safe distance and use against the Ukrainians. As we can actually see here on this picture, where a Su-34 released 4 of these UMPK bombs. And of course it's not only those bombs which are inflicting heavy damage on the Ukrainians, but it's especially
these systems now, these guided glide bombs that the Russians started using and are now increasingly using, and it is causing significant amounts of damage to Ukrainian forces as we speak. There's anywhere from 50 to 100 strikes per day with these 1,000-pound, 2,000-pound glide bombs. And the Ukrainians don't have an answer for these systems. They can't respond in kind with airdropped munitions, the likes of which the Russians are attacking the Ukrainians with.
Especially also the arsenal of the Russians when it comes to cruise missiles and ballistic rockets, because also here we have to admit that the production rate of the Russian side has increased significantly. And to give you an idea of the result of those attacks, we would like to show you a video where you can actually see the impact of those UMPK bombs against the staging areas of the Ukrainian side. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian side is in desperate need of certain weapon systems. And after several months, and when it was clear that the Ukrainian success was not actually like intended, the Americans delivered a certain weapon system to give the Ukrainians the possibility to go into the offensive, to have a momentum again. And that weapon system was the Army Tactical Missile, which was delivered in an amount of between 20 to 30 pieces to the Ukrainians. And of course, the Ukrainians needed those weapon systems to fight against certain assets of the Russian side. And one of these certain assets was, of course, the Russian helicopters. So these attack camps were used against a Russian airfield with cluster warheads. And immediately you were able to see what kind of a difference it made when weapon systems are available which are in need for the Ukrainian side, because several helicopters were not even destroyed but even damaged on the Russian side. And these tactical and operational assessments bring us to the point that we have a stalemate in the conflict. And General Zaluzhny, The commander of the Ukrainian armed forces just recently in an article very clearly stated that there is not this kind of deep and beautiful breakthrough. No, there is a stalemate actually. And one of the things which is behind this stalemate is the situation that both sides...
And remember, this Zelensky is now getting attacked by Zelensky. The godlike deity portrayed by us here in the West, but again, miscalculation, continued miscalculation. He has no military experience, Zelensky, none, zero. It has a very heavy hand in what is happening in this conflict.
Are able actually to observe what the other side is doing. Why is this possible? Because there is a so-called transparent battlefield, because hundreds of drones are able to observe each side. So you can see actually which side is staging forces and which side is going from the staging into the maneuver, because those drones not only can observe these actions, but they are also used against these staging areas or against the maneuver force.
Just real quick on the FPV drones. This is something that the Russians have been very late to the dance on. They have deployed surveillance drones. They have deployed the Lancet drone, which is essentially a very large FPV kamikaze drone, very expensive. But the deployment of these small civilian racing drones with a very small amount of explosives attached to them have become incredibly effective. And that's one area where Russian doctrine is hampering the Russians. The higher-ups in the Russian chain of command are not completely keen on the deployment of these small FPV civilian drones. The Russians have used them. We've seen Wagner use them. We've seen some of the Novorossiya units, irregular formations using them, but by no means is there a Russian Ministry of Defense training site where they are deploying these small FPV drones. It's not happened yet. Now, could it happen? Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, the Lancet is a very effective system, but the Ukrainians are one step ahead of the Russians in terms of deploying these small racing drones fit with explosives, and they've become incredibly effective, especially with a very proficient person operating those drones.
And there is a certain type of weapon which is very successful, used on both sides, and this is the so-called first-person view drone, which is a very simple and cheap asset to be used against even heavy equipment like a Leopard or Challenger tank. Those first-person view drones are used by both sides. So the Ukrainians are using those drones, but also the Russians are using them. The problem is that the Russians are able to actually produce them on the industrial scale, like we can see here. And in the next video, we'd like to show you how it looks like when one of these first-person view drones actually is attacking a heavy main battle tank, in this case a Leopard. But it's not only the production of these first-person view drones which makes a difference, it's also the case that the military-industrial complex of the Russians are able to produce very capable weapon system like the so-called Lancet kamikaze drone. Because this drone gives the Russians the possibility to act deep behind the Ukrainian front lines. They actually use a system of hunter-killer drones. So there are hunter drones who do the reconnaissance and killer drones like the Lancet who are working on certain assets of the Ukrainian side deep behind the battlefield. We would like to give you one example which shows how tricky the situation for the Ukrainian side is, because in this video you can actually see the use of a Lancet drone against two high-value assets. One is a Su-25 ground attack aircraft and the other one is a MiG-29 fighter plane. So as General Solution said, the war is at a stalemate. And that means that the war goes on. So now let us look at the front line, at these 1,200 kilometers, and let us look along the front line in detail in certain sectors, what's going on there. So first of all, we can assess that like...
Well, folks, I have to jump on a conference call. Again, we're kind of getting into the status quo now. So we will continue our coverage of this. Feel free to go to this content and watch it yourself. A pretty good overview of kind of what happened, and we will continue to review what is happening. Thanks for joining us, and as always, have a great day.